Good morning, everybody. And glad to be with all of you. You all should know that whenever I receive a call from President Carol Mason and Erica Bond inviting me to spend some time at John Jay, I jump at the chance. And then I say, well, now what am I going to do? And so that is kind of what happened once again here. Uh, I'm a lawyer by training. And so one of the first things that we learn as lawyers is to issue disclosures. And the first disclosure that I've got to provide you all is that I am not a criminal justice expert. I am not in the least bit a criminal justice expert, but I am expert on the issues that undergird, in many respects, criminal justice in America. And that really is, racism, sexism in many instances, and economic insecurity. Now, those are but some, not all, but several of the issues that intersect with and often bring about justice involvement here in America. And my exposure has been vast. Everything from working in child welfare in the early 90s and looking at the experiences of children who became known to the child welfare system here in New York, and often seeing that their families had been justice involved. And then later on, learning more and more about adverse childhood experiences and how foster care involvement, justice involvement for the family really impacts children. Learning a lot how very often children who are exposed to incarceration and justice, may have a greater likelihood of becoming justice involved. I lead an organization, the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, that centers on the community's experience, largely with economic insecurity and all the issues that attend. In 2015, I was asked by then Mayor de Blasio to serve on the Board of Correction. And I'm just going to be very honest with you. My first thought was no, I'm not at all expert in these matters. And I don't want to just take up space. And then after, I'd say, some cajoling and an appreciation that I guess I did need to be there, I went and I served on the board. And what I came to appreciate were a few things. One, that our incarceration system looks very much like modern day slavery, excepting that there are little to no skills being taught. I came to appreciate when I looked at the New York City jails that it wasn't just, quantitative data, it was true. Like it wasn't just the numbers on the pages, that the people in our jails in New York City are disproportionately, highly disproportionately Black and brown people. I came to appreciate that the correction system is highly people of color. And I'm going to just put it out here. And there's a trauma in that, in and of itself. When you've got Black and brown people putting their feet on the necks of Black and brown people, what do you think that does to community? It was there that I began to appreciate that so much of the work that we do when we center on criminal justice and justice in other forms, child welfare, housing, taking care of people with mental health, that we have to center on one thing that we often forget. We have to do good while doing no further harm. I want you to hold that because that's what this panel is about today. Doing good while doing no further harm. About 2 years ago, there was a research report put out by the Research Alliance at NYU that centers on educational experiences of children here in New York City. The report looked at communities where there's a high concentration of policing and arrests. And it found that the rate of graduation is significantly lower for Black children in communities where there's a high rate of policing and justice involvement. The report also found that it was not just for the children who'd been directly involved with justice or their families, but for the children at large in those communities, that being in the epicenter had a profound impact on their experiences, their educational outcomes. Friends, we need to look at how do we go about the business of ensuring safety for New Yorkers and Americans at large without doing any further harm to people who for so long have been disproportionately involved in the justice system. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at these issues today. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about the quantitative data, but we're going to lean in a lot to the qualitative. The stories that are often not told, the experiences. The lawyer in me is often taught to look at things black and white, but things aren't black and white when it comes to justice involvement. And so we're going to look in and we're going to speak about the multiple truths that attend. How communities that are over-policed do want safety, but they want to be supported and cared for. We're going to talk about these issues. Is that fair, friends? All right. So you heard the names of the panelists, but I'll repeat them. And they are Jamila Hodge, Jami, she's the Executive Director at Equal Justice USA. Andre Ward, Executive Director, Institute for Justice and Opportunity. Danielle Sored, Executive Director for Common Justice. And Khalil Cumberbatch, Director of Engagement and Partnerships at the Council on Criminal Justice. I'd like them all to take a moment, just 2 minutes or so, to introduce yourselves to the audience. And yes, I want you to say a little bit about the work that you do, but I also want people to appreciate how you're showing up in this work, because sometimes that's more important than the title. Why do you do what you do? And so we'll take it from Andre and we'll go all the way down to Khalil.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody feeling this morning? Partly cloudy, chance of showers, or sunny? Which one? I would hope everybody is sunny this morning. My name is Andre Ward, as you mentioned. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Justice and Opportunity here at John Jay College. And for 20 years, the Institute for Justice and Opportunity has been in existence under different names through the vision of Jeremy Travis. Jeremy is still here. But the Institute for Justice and Opportunity has been around for 20 years, working to advance ideas to transform institutions, systems, and individuals. And we do that by engaging the students that we serve and partnering with them so that we can end barriers to things like housing, education, employment. And ultimately, by engaging our people that we serve, who are students, we, in our collaborative work with them, support them in being co-creators of public safety. Because it's one thing to have people go through programs, experience interactions with many of us, and it's another thing to educate and empower them as a partner so they can go out to be co-creators of public safety. So really happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, y'all. I'm Danielle Sored. I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director for Common Justice, where we develop and advance solutions to violence that meet the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. At the core of our work is a restorative justice-based alternative to incarceration and victim service program for serious and violent felonies that we operate here in New York City. We are also supporting partners across the country now who are standing up similar interventions in places ranging from St. Louis to Jackson, Mississippi, to Nashville and Memphis, and other more emergent places all across the country, red and blue states alike. We do a fair amount of narrative shifting work because of our appreciation of how much of this battle is not just policy, but culture. And then we do policy and organizing work to move the levers of power and the underlying structures that drive violence in the first place. I come to this work as somebody with an enormous appreciation of the incredible inequities in the criminal legal system. As someone who is a white child, learned about those inequities and as a beneficiary of them, and decided at that time I would have to find the people fighting them, join with them, and keep doing that until we won or I died, and neither has happened yet, so I'm still here. And I also come to the work as a survivor of serious violence with a deep appreciation that the solutions we have can't only be about liberation, they have to also be about safety and healing. It's great to be with you all today.
Good morning, everybody. Anytime I hear Danielle introduce her work, I think about so much alignment because there's so much that I'm going to say that I feel like I could just say what she said. My name is Jamila Hodge, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of leading Equal Justice USA. We're a national organization that works at the intersection of criminal justice, racial justice, and public health. And essentially, we work with those most impacted by violence to support and uplift solutions to violence that are outside of the criminal legal system. We also then organize and mobilize with them for policy change and particularly for resource reallocation so that some of the $300 billion that we spend on police, prosecution, and prisons can be used to actually interrupt and disrupt and prevent violence. And then we help tell their stories and shine a light so that people can understand that safety is more than the absence of violence and that it's the presence of things that neighborhoods and communities need to thrive. I come to this work as someone who, growing up, saw intimately the devastating and long-lasting impacts of violence and the devastating and long-lasting impacts of the violence of incarceration in my family. And I took a path thinking that if I work in the system as a power holder, I was a prosecutor for 12 years in DC, that using that power differently could minimize the harm that particularly Black communities bear from the way the system responds to violence and harm. And moving to EJUSA nearly 4 years ago was really with the recognition that while it's important to reduce the harm, we have to build other responses and solutions that are rooted in something other than racial oppression, but can be rooted in healing and repair and accountability that actually repairs, not accountability that's solely focused on punishment. It's great to be with you.
What she said. No, Khalil Cumberbatch, director at the Council on Criminal Justice, and the council is a think tank and membership organization for which a number of people, both on this panel and in the audience, including Jeremy and Carol, are members. We bring together members from the different ends of the spectrum as it relates to not only political, ideological alignment, but also in the way that we approach the work of criminal justice and criminal justice reform. Been there for about, actually almost 5 years now, and I have done a ton of work in the New York City and New York State area. But the direct answer to your question about like what I view as my purpose of coming to this work on a daily basis is really around a sense of urgency. I think that, quite honestly, the field has had some wins, and there's been a lot of complacency with that, if I'm being honest. Mm-hmm. I think that that we have a lot to be proud of as a field, but there's also a lot of work that needs to continue, and there's some new work that needs to happen. And so that's what brings me to the work, and I'm really happy to be able to join everyone on this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and seeing the other conversations that come later today.
Absolutely. As I listened to you all, I realized that, so much of what you said resonated with me, and I also appreciate that I didn't actually tell you what brings me into this space. And a lot of it has to do with being a child, growing up in a home with faith and social justice as like those were the breakfast, lunch, and dinner conversations. Going to law school and appreciating that I did not want to be part of systems that were stood up, to bring about law and order without looking at the experiences of people on a daily basis and how they were, essentially falling into, what the system desired that, the way it was set up to work. And finding myself at a certain point in child welfare and realizing that there was so much emphasis, understandably, and there's, a lot of talk right now out in the media about the child welfare system in New York City, questioning whether or not by placing children with families and centering on prevention, whether or not we are harming children. But systems where safety seems to come without any consideration for people, lived experience, structural and systemic inequalities and inequities. And in child welfare, it was all about safety and very little about family well-being. when I was there and really trying to shift that. Jama, you mentioned that you engage in policy. You know, so much of what happens when we go about reforming can contribute to the perpetuation of systemic inequalities. And I'm going to put out there, I think it's intentional. I think it's willful. I think sometimes things are put up to make you feel that things are getting better, but they're only moving in one direction. What are some examples of policies? Maybe I'm asking a leading question. I'm an attorney, I should stop. But what are some of the examples, policy examples, that, you know, where we see that we are actually perpetuating inequality?
I mean, we could say almost any policy tied to the criminal justice system. I think about the problem that we're trying to solve for in the work that we do at EJUSA, which is the fact that our society responds to violence and harm with a racist punishment framework, and there are few other options, alternatives. That's just the way we respond. And so you can pick really anything. You can pick mandatory minimums. You can pick the use of cash bail, which means legally innocent people are held solely because they don't have access to money. We can pick all the collateral consequences that come with whether or not you ever serve a day in jail or prison, what that conviction means in terms of access to housing, to jobs, to your kids, you know. And so while all of those policies, I think it's important to do the policy change work. I never want to minimize that. As much as we can reduce the harm, so where we can end cash bail, and I know cash bail has had a tricky history here in New York. But you know, we do have states where we can see Illinois recently and other states where you can, or you can limit it. You know, whatever progress can be made is impacting people every single day. So the work of reducing harm, even when it comes, because we know policy doesn't get passed, laws don't get changed without compromise. So you always lose something in the fight. But if we can win more than we lose and know that lives are impacted, then it's worth the fight. We have to do the fight. But I don't think there's anything that's untouched by racism and punishment as a framework because of how our system was built and the framing of and who our system was meant to target and still targets.
Right. And for what purpose, right? All rooted in economic and political power, right? I mean, at the core, this is what this is all about. Fair? So, interestingly, you know, one of the things that for so long wasn't paid attention to was that you have policing, arrest, people sent to prison, people sent to jail, awaiting trial, and then sent to prison if found guilty. And we never paid attention to it. Supposedly, it's all about rehabilitation. But we never paid attention to, or for so long we did not pay attention to, the harms. And I think that the harms still are minimized. And so, let's see, I'll go with Khalil. I'll ask you, what do you believe are some of the most significant consequences of incarceration that we need to touch upon, that we need to, not even touch upon, we need to highlight. We need to, like, in your face spotlight that these things can't go, you know, without being examined and addressed.
How much time do we have? I think that, I mean, you name it, you know, I mean, well, let's start with the biggest one, which is we could policy and legislate our way out of all of the legal collateral consequences of a criminal conviction, let alone a felony or incarceration, just a simple criminal conviction. But we still have not begun to tackle the biggest hurdle of a criminal conviction, which is the stigma that exists behind having exposure to the criminal justice system. There are still people who believe at their core that if you were arrested, you absolutely did something wrong. Not because it was a quota time, not because you didn't understand the rules, not because you didn't understand the language that was being spoken, just simply because you were put in handcuffs. What did you do wrong? So that's the biggest consequence that I would say, is that for many people, you're constantly throughout the course of your life, no matter what you've done, you could have ran into a burning building quite literally. And there are cases like this where a man ran into a burning building and saved 3 people. And still, it was highlighted in the news article. The first thing was that he had a felony conviction. And so that is one of the biggest hurdles. And then,
And
of
then there's
course,
the trauma that comes with that.
well, there's the psychological trauma, there's the physical trauma, right? And then there's the intergenerational trauma. Because if a person has had children during incarceration, or if their children have been exposed to any part of the system, right? I mean, we're focusing on incarceration, but having the law enforcement kick in your door at any time, and having someone come into a home and secure it and do all of that, that comes with a deep level of trauma that a child may not be ready to understand. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that one of the most paid attention to collateral consequences right now is the consequence that happens with immigration. People who have been exposed to the criminal justice system, and again, not necessarily conviction, just a simple exposure, opens them up for, in some cases, mandatory detention. So again, very similar to the bail situation. Simply because you've been accused of a crime, and maybe in cases you were convicted of a crime, we have to detain you without question, without any consideration of what connections you have to a community, what resources you have in a community, what support system you have in a community. And then in some cases, it is almost a mandatory deportation, which for someone who has served a lengthy period of time, maybe deportation and freedom outside of the criminal justice system here in the US represents freedom. But the reality is that most people are returning to a country in which they no longer consider to be home, quite honestly. And so, again, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that one. But unfortunately, we're talking about a litany of collateral consequences that come not only from incarceration again, but simply, in some cases, simply just by being exposed to the criminal justice system.
And, we have to appreciate that part of, like, one of the biggest consequences is also economic insecurity. Many people becoming justice involved already economically insecure. But then once justice involved, it's like the system just does what it does. And again, this is me in my opinion, it's intentional and willful. If once justice involved, like how do you go about getting a job? Meaningful pay. Like limitations on your access to loans in order to secure higher education. All of those issues attend, and that is by design.
Yeah.
By design. So we saw in the teens that in the 20 teens more emphasis on alternatives to incarceration, perhaps appreciating to a certain extent that that incarceration wasn't working, wasn't achieving all of like the posited aims, and so we begin centering more on alternatives to incarceration. We also have seen an uptake in victim services. Still, there are harms that attend. And we want to shed light on those. So Danielle, help us.
Yeah, so I think it is impossible to actually be day in and day out in the criminal legal system and not observe the range of its harms. There are plenty of very good people working within that system. It does not mean that system produces good outcomes for the people who come through it. And so for people who are responsible for harm, we work with people who actually did the things they're accused of, right? We call them responsible parties in common justice. Like for our responsible parties, they enter into a system where the only person on their side in that room, the defense attorney, tells them to say they are not guilty, and they do that immediately after they have told their defense attorney that they are in fact guilty. So the one person in their corner advises them to lie about what they've done, right? So we pretend this is a system about accountability. That's bullshit. Everyone on this panel knows I'm always the first one to swear. Some of you in the audience also know this. In that system, they are treated as people who are where the only question is whether and how much additional harm they will cause to the victim in their case, to others in the world, to their own families. There is no consideration ever that they may be somebody with the inherent human dignity and what attaches to that, which is the inherent capacity to participate in repair. That they are somebody who could be part of making right the thing that they wronged. That is never considered as a possibility. They are in those rooms surrounded by people, armed people on all sides, and they know at any second they could say the wrong thing and the wrong door could open and they could be taken through it and put behind there in a small cage. They do that, our participants, on the days they have done best, when they are walking into court with a perfect court report, feel the terror and threat of that present every single time. I believe people can feel every other person who has come through those rooms and what has happened to them. I believe people can feel every one of their ancestors who have been in cages and chains, whether in that system or in other comparable systems. That pain is everywhere. And then those collateral consequences folks are talking about attach immediately. So just at the moment they are where it is most important that they demonstrate they can be productive members of society, they have an open felony on their record and cannot get jobs and cannot get housing and cannot get student loans, cannot get any of the things that would actually position them to succeed. So it is terrifying, like there is an element of terror, there is an element of threat, and it's deeply dehumanizing to people. But I think it's important to remember that that system is very similar for victims of crime. And particularly true for survivors of color. It is not as though a system that at every single point of discretion produces racial disparities turns to survivors and is suddenly like impeccably anti-racist. That's not what happens. Survivors of color are likelier to be questioned about their memory of what happened, to be disbelieved, to also be arrested when they're hurt, to be pathologized for wanting something other than jail or prison for the people who hurt them. The sheer structure of court, victims have no legal standing in the criminal legal system other than being able to make a statement at sentencing that has been demonstrated to have no impact whatsoever on sentencing. No legal standing in a system that we say is in victims' names, right? And what they want is they want to ask questions. They want to ask why. They want to know, was it a real gun? Was it who I was? Was it because I fought back, didn't fight back? All of it. There is no space for that whatsoever. They want honesty on the part of the person who hurt them, which, as we talked about before, the first instruction that person gets is to say they didn't do it. So they never really arrive at that honesty, including once a plea bargain happens that's just negotiation. It's not truth. Right? So none of those things, and they don't get restitution back from somebody who is behind bars and is earning at 11 cents an hour if they're lucky, right? They don't get their answers, they don't get to receive repair, and there's no question about whether they too need and deserve something to transform. I want to say two very quick things. One is we talk about this balance between safety and equity, and I don't think that's true. Safety and equity are on the same side of the scale. Inequity is productive of violence. Like violence is driven by structural inequity. And so when we say like we want safety, but we have to be fair, we're really mistaken. We have misunderstood the fundamental evidence that demonstrates the prison is criminogenic, right? That people in that system are likelier to commit harm than people who get away with things, right? That it is productive of violence. And so when we act as though we're making a choice between those things, we are buying into a mythology about how that punishment systems work that is just factually incorrect and logically incorrect. Like if you had a child who was messing around and not living the way you wanted them to, you wouldn't think of separating them from everyone they knew, putting them in a cage, depriving them of food and education, and threatening them with and or subjecting them to violence every day as a solution. It doesn't make sense to those of us who think about people who are causing harm as people we love. And the last thing I'll say is, as you know, you open with this thing about alternatives growing. There are times I think the most radical question we can ask about the criminal justice system is compared to what? Like compared to what? The solutions we have are so much better at producing safety than all of that ever has been or ever will be. And I find that my deepest rage at that system is not just in witnessing the extraordinary harms it inflicts on the people who pass through it. It is witnessing those harms in the presence of options that do not cause those harms and actually heal the wounds. And it's that fact, it's the fact of our choosing it in the presence of other options that I think is the most unconscionable choice we make.
So well said. You know, as I listened to you, I couldn't help but thinking and listening to the others that we don't often think about the kind of the communal experience. And who is the community that is most devastatingly impacted by justice involvement? and how there are multiple truths that attend that community, beginning with the structural injustices and the resultant harms. That tie into racism, sexism, immigration. We look at it sometimes, we like to think of it as though they're individuals, but and then there's the guilty and the harm, but the harmed are guilty. The harmed are guilty in the minds of people, right? And you get what I'm saying by that, right? And so then it's like this cyclical, it's a cycle that repeats. And I just keep coming back to by design. And so, Andre, when you look at it from a community perspective, you know, what are the barriers that we need to be calling out?
Yeah, I think several of the barriers, but one in particular is, again, how our communities are being policed. When we think about the history of stop and frisk and the impact that it's had on our communities, we realize that from the perspective of people of color, at least, and in my own personal experience in growing up and having been sentenced and incarcerated and spending a significant amount of time in prison, communities of color invariably see law enforcement in a way that, on the one hand, it's law and order in our communities. In other communities that are non-people of color necessarily, it's serve and protect. And when you think about that dichotomy where on one hand, you're serving and protecting some folk, but on the other hand, it's law and order, it's obviously gonna cause trauma. And you're gonna see an increase in the people who are looked at and engaged from the perspective of law and order, jailed more and more, incarcerated more and more, and lacking access to resources that they need. And when we think about how the community is impacted by law enforcement and policing and the criminal legal system, the other thing that it does, it causes social fragmentation. People aren't able to be connected as a community as they should. Families are separated. Children no longer have parents. Loved ones are no longer be able to connect with their loved ones because they're taken out of the community. A huge resource. Thousands of people from New York City going up to New York State prisons. Resources that can support communities staying healthy and whole and not harmed. And I'll stop there.
You could go on and on, right? I know you said probably, it definitely could, because again, I keep on coming back to, because I want us to hold, it's not happenstance, right? The construct of like the centuries old term ghetto, segregate people, put certain people based on race, and in Europe at one point it was based on religion, put them in certain communities, starve them of critical resources, educational, health, and economic, and then watch them fend for themselves, and watch the cycle repeat over and over. You're going to get certain outcomes, and it persists today. It's by design. So when we understand that this is not just good efforts gone, gone awry, that there's an intentionality here. What are the solutions that we can advance that hold the two truths? That yes, we do want justice. We want people to be safe. But frankly, we want all people to be safe. And I define safety not just as, public safety, but emotionally, physically safe, mentally well. What are the solutions that we need to be advancing, continually advancing, even when the money is being rolled back, even when we have people who use narrative at the federal and at the local levels, suggesting that you can't have both, that they can't be on the same side? What are the solutions that we need to be advancing, especially in this mayoral moment, right? What do we need to be pressing for here in New York City and beyond? So I'll begin with you, Jami. What do you believe are examples of solutions that have proven effective and things that we could be doing more of?
So the first thing I'll say, is to bring the question up a little bit, is we have to get rid of the myth of good versus bad. Everything we do in our current criminal legal system is based on this myth that there are bad people that need to be removed and harmed, and that's how we protect us good people, without actually realizing we're all good and bad, all of us. And if we see the dignity, the worth, the humanity, and see, I know in my years when I was a prosecutor, I never had a case, never had a person who was accused of serious harm who wasn't a victim first. We never called them a victim, though. Never called them, and it was untreated, and it often started in childhood. You know, all the failures of the systems, the intergenerational removal of parents from homes. And so when we realize, like, by labeling them bad from kids, and then as an adult in this system, then it absolves us, right, of treating them with dignity and worth, believing in their ability to change and to do things differently. So before policy change, before structural change, we have to have like a heart change. And we have to really understand that everybody is a person, regardless. I don't care if you've murdered 100 people, you are a person who has dignity and worth. And if we ask the questions of why, not just what you did, but why, we will unearth many failures that we have contributed to as a society. So the solution for me is that we keep people out of this system in every possible way. And that means investing in the community base, and I know there's a number of panels that are going to be on this over the next couple of days, which I'm great, highlighting community-based solutions that are on the ground, front showing up at the scenes of the shootings, showing up at the hospitals to support people who have been shot, the real-time de-escalation, but also the prevention. We know trauma drives violence. So when youth have been exposed repeatedly to trauma, we should be wrapping our arms around them. So for me, the real solutions are we don't bring people in the first place, because we know the chance of them being harmed, the chance of them coming out worse is very high. But even for those who are coming in, there are so many power holders, whether that's police, prosecutors, who have discretion, and they can decide, do I bring you in and book you, or do I make a referral to the many programs that exist in the city and the state, instead of bringing you into something that I know isn't actually going to treat what brought you in the first place? And then there's prosecutors who can do the same thing, who can make the diversion recommendation. So the answer to me is you keep people out in every possible way. And even for those who come in, we have a ton of work to do for how we treat people once they are in.
So, quick question, just a response to appreciating everything that you've said and agreeing with you. Where my mind goes is, okay, but criminal justice is a system operating within a larger system, and I've more than alluded to it over the course of the last 30 minutes. It's all steeped in economic and political, power, and the desire to withhold economic and political power from some, and to have it reside in just a select few. And so the good bad, while I agree with you on that, I mean, the good bad has been in existence since the beginning of this nation and even before, right? You know, how do we set up a system of slavery? By determining that people who have a darker hue are less than, are bad, right? You know, you come out of slavery. And how do you decide who shall have you in New York, where slavery and the slave trade was a big, big part of our economy? Who shall have and who shall not? And when the industrial society, when the industrial age began, to weaken, who do you decide when you have less jobs is less worthy, is bad? People of color. And so, yes, we've got to figure out how we shift the narrative, but you can't shift it if you don't center on this bigger issue of unjust economic and political power, and how racism and even sexism, misogyny, feeds that system. So that's a part of it. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Okay, we're on the same page. So, just building on that, If people who are justice involved from the criminal side are seen as less than, bad, not worthy, how do we bring them into the conversation? Have their voices really be heard to see their worth and their value and what they can teach us? And Andre, you're doing this work.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and one I'm grateful that was developed. And I really want to acknowledge Carol Mason, President Carol Mason here, because of her acknowledgement of the fact that people directly impacted or formerly incarcerated can lead, can inform, can develop, can design, can implement, can evaluate, can do all of those things. And I think it's critically important that people that are formerly incarcerated are in leadership in places where they are impacted or have been impacted. And we're not talking about tokenism, right? Some mere tokenistic kind of engagement. We're talking about real, authentic power sharing, where people that are formerly incarcerated are informing the discussion, informing the decisions, and creating solutions for the communities that they contributed to harm toward. So I think one of the things we have to make sure is super clear about is making sure that people who are formerly incarcerated are informing and in leading. And so that's one answer to that question.
And when we haven't done that, then how do we ensure that we're actually holding people accountable? And I know, Khalil, you focused on that. The institutions that continue to perpetuate this harm knowingly, how do we hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, there's the power of the vote. I mean, as cliche as that sounds, especially here in the city where, I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say like there is a deep, deep level of competition to see who will be the next mayor of New York City. And so voting, I think, is important on all levels, local, state, midterm, general, all of it. The other thing is that we can't have a conversation about the criminal justice system as if it's just the criminal justice system. The reality is that crime largely is a result of some other social issue. I've never met let me not make any blanket statements. I've met people during my incarceration who were very successful in what they did as it relates to crime. Very smart people, very, very business savvy, very entrepreneurial. The only resource that they had access to very easily, which is a whole other conversation, was drugs. Same thing with scammers for the younger generation. Those are kids who are extremely smart and have figured out how to maneuver through and around and jump hurdles over a system that was put in place to keep our information safe. I say all of that just offering two examples, but of course there are many others, of that crime is not, we can't talk about the criminal justice system just focusing on holding the criminal justice system accountable. Now, yes, there are actors and players in that system that need to make sure that accountability is at the top of their list, not only in the way that they engage in the system, but also the way that they hold people accountable who come through their system. We also need to focus on things like the economic structure of the communities that are most impacted by over-policing or just policing in general. We also have to stop thinking, quite honestly, that this is a black and brown problem. If you go to Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, there are some very poor white people who face the same social issues. And so we can't keep having this conversation as if New York City, and I say this as a New Yorker, so nobody come up to me after this panel and say, we can't keep having this conversation if New York City is the beginning and end of this. It's not, because once you leave New York City, if you go 20 miles north, south, east, or west, you cannot use the same terminology that we can use here on this stage. You can't do it in Albany, you can't do it in Jersey, you can't do it in Illinois, Alabama, you name it. And I say that only to say that sometimes we have to pull the lens back and understand that there is a 30,000 feet in the air conversation that needs to happen. We also need to understand that we need to stop framing the conversation as if it's just the criminal justice system. And then the last thing I'll say is that we also need to dramatically redefine the terms that we use. Because the term justice to me is extremely loaded in a ton of racial context that yes, goes very, very much back to the founding of this country. but also things like accountability, things like harm, things like violence, things like victim, things like perpetrator, things like inmate, things like convict, things like felon, and to be honest with you, things like the term formerly incarcerated, because at this point, that's even loaded.
Yeah.
So we have to take the lens back sometimes and ask ourselves, honestly, as an advocacy community, there are deep levels of conversations that we are just not having. And it's easy to just point at the system and say, yes, we need to fix that system. Yes, we all agree, whether you're an abolitionist, reformist, whatever you want to call it. I don't even subscribe to those terms anymore. But I just feel like sometimes as a community, the most deepest reckoning that we need to have is amongst ourselves. And we have not had that conversation. And there are a lot of people who quite honestly have been more harmful to this field than Donald Trump or anybody else will ever be, in the way that they have operated and the way that they have created little fiefdoms for themselves and caused deep levels of division. So I say all of that just to say, I'll wrap it up, is that yes, the criminal justice system is the intended target in terms of how do we dramatically shift the thinking that exists in all levels of that. But we also can't act as if we're the choir and we're all singing in harmony, because it's just not true.
Indeed.
And if we're being the most strategic, we have to also understand that sometimes the best role that you can play as the quote unquote leader in the room is to be quiet and to
So
let
well
other
said.
people lead.
So well said. No. No need to be sorry in that. We're going to move to questions and answers in just a moment. But, you know, this is that moment where we have to think about being transformative and moving beyond what is, what has been, the way things have always been done. And so, Danielle, you're engaged in what many deem transformative work. And if you can provide an example or two as we move to Q&A for us, one or two examples of what it looks like to be transformative in this moment, centering on reducing harms and less use of incarceration.
Sure, and I also want to offer sort of what that teaches us about what it looks like to reckon with all of the things that have been talked about today, right? With the harms within our movement, with the harms that go back generations within this nation. And so people in common justice who've caused harm engage in repairing that. And so we talk about accountability, that it's in the public discourse. It's usually used synonymously with punishment. The longer I do this work, the more I think they're not just not synonymous, they're antithetical. The punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to you. All you have to do to be punished is not escape. Accountability is active. In our view, it requires that you acknowledge what you've done, acknowledge its impact, express genuine remorse, make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and become someone who will not cause that harm ever again. We watch in our day-to-day work the labor of that, which is extraordinarily hard labor, transform our responsible parties who are released from their shame back into their human dignity. We watch it transform our harmed parties who are honored and acknowledged not just generally, but by the person who caused harm and have a say in what it looks like to make it right. But I honestly think those steps are the same for us at a movement level, at a national level, in contending with systems. Like, we as a nation have continued to use incarceration despite knowing everything we said. None of what any of us said on this panel is new. It is widely known. And in the presence of that knowledge, we've opted over and over and over again for this system by design. And we owe something for that. We owe it not only to the people who've been in the system, but all of the people who could have been made safe by other solutions and were not, right? So the reach of our responsibility collectively is vast. And I think the steps for that are the same. I think we acknowledge what we've done. We acknowledge its impact. We express genuine remorse. We make things as right as possible, ideally a way defined by those harmed. And we become a people who will never do it ever again. And I understand there are ways in which that may feel lofty or farther away in the current political moment in this nation. where we are all like back on our heels and in a really serious defensive posture. But it is my deep belief that there is no way to a future of a genuine multiracial democracy but through that reckoning. So my sense is that the question in America of who belongs, who doesn't, who is dangerous, who does the protecting, those questions have been centrally surfaced for us. Would it have been better had we surfaced them more centrally when we had more levers of power? In my view, yes. But here we are. And this has always been the fight in this country. Since 1619, since 1492. These questions have been the ones that we have fought over for centuries. And it's my view that the only way we will fight and win is if we contend honestly and thoroughly with everything that got us here in the first place.
Could not agree more with you and with, frankly, with all that's been expressed. And we're going to move to Q&A, but we have to keep in mind, and Khalil, you spoke to it, this is a disproportionately Black and brown issue, but it's an all people's issue, right? And it has a lot to do with the intersection of poverty. And that's something that, like Stanley and I worked together, President Fortune, forgive me, President Stanley Richards from Fortune Society. So little is said about the intersection of race, justice, and poverty. It's race and justice, it's poverty and justice, but we very rarely kind of like run it through the full thread. And I'm going to say it again, it ties back to the nation's foundational desire for some to have and others not. And so that's also how white people can get caught up in it, because they are immaterial to the few who have. This is what Martin King was speaking about when he waged the poverty war, right? This is what, frankly, from the Black Panthers, Fred Hampton, he became most dangerous when he began bringing everybody together. Malcolm X became more dangerous and they started talking about everybody, all who are affected by this. So appreciate these points, but we've got to go deeper. Justice is part of. Do we have any questions? Do we have any thoughts? Lots, I hope.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Hi, I'm Justine Olderman. Nice to see everyone. One thing that I would love to hear you all talk about, Danielle, you touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that I've sort of been struggling with, there's so much data, there's so much evidence out there, as you all have talked about how our current approach does not lead to greater public safety, however you define that term. But one of the things that I'm struggling with and that I think sometimes we miss and that we have to also grapple with is that we live in a deeply, deeply vindictive, punitive society. And so what I would love to hear you talk about is, what do you think are some of the ways that we can grapple with that? Because even in the face of data showing that alternatives to incarceration make us safer, there is still this drive to cause harm, to punish, to hurt. There is a satisfaction that we get as a society from seeing that, and that seems like one of these sort of fundamental issues that we have to grapple with if we are in fact going to be successful in dismantling our current oppressive system. Thanks.
I think it would transform our criminal legal system if our non-negotiable for it were safety. It's not, to your point, our non-negotiable is revenge. And I think part of what the cultural work is of becoming a society whose very favorite thing isn't revenge, is to build a muscle of repair. We have a lot of impunity, extraordinary amounts of impunity, generational, and we have an extraordinary amount of punishment. And we have very little example of repair. And what repair does is it creates a container that honors and holds the rage, the pain, the loss, the things that otherwise accrue to revenge, and addresses it by not asking for forgiveness, not seeking mercy, but engaging in repair. And I don't believe that a relationship without a capacity for repair can last. I don't believe a movement without capacity for repair can last. And I don't believe that a nation without capacity for repair can last. So I think there is a lot of work for us to think about what are all the sites of repair where we can practice it. And I don't mean we need a reparations commission tomorrow, right? I mean, like, where have we caused harm in our relationships, in our community, like with our loved ones in these spaces? And how do we start to envision not just apologizing, but making things right? Like, how do we start to build that muscle that has atrophied so greatly, in part because of the way the criminal justice system has been inserted between everyone who's committed harm and everyone who's been harmed, and instead reclaim that place of tending to hurt and building this other thing?
Can I just add, and it's also uplifting it so that people know that these things exist. I'm still amazed that we spend so much time in these spaces where we do know what restorative justice is. We do know that there's something we can do besides punish, but this is not like the average person. And I'm constantly amazed, even in my own family, when I'm talking to nieces and nephews who are entering adulthood and talking about what I do, how little they know. They only know what is fed to us, which is there's only one option when violence happens, and we have to police and incarcerate and punish. That's what we do. So there's a lot of work to do to uplift that. It's not that we don't have solutions. People aren't talking about them. People are unaware of them. And it's hard to even have a choice to engage in something that you don't know exists. So we need to have more like public facing, uplifting of stories so that people know there's something else.
Is there another question?
Hi. Thank you all very much. Very inspiring panel. Also, thank you to the organizers for starting with this panel. I think it's absolutely the right place to start all of these conversations. To just quickly pull a thread through some of the things you have said and then a question. You spoke about how we can have this conversation here, on this stage with these perspectives. Most places are not equipped to have this kind of conversation. I think that's true outside of New York, but also very much so within New York, and for a lot of people within New York who are subscribed to, whether intentionally or not, some of the myths about safety and justice that we've talked about, because they've been intentionally put in a position to believe in these myths that we in this room know are the opposite to be true. I had a conversation with my own mother this week as I was planning to come to this event. And she made a remark about people getting pushed in front of subways. And, I want more police in the subway if that's a situation that I know I need to be afraid of, when my kids are in the city or whatever it may be. So my question would be, what recommendations do you all have for people like that to gain exposure to the positive conditions of safety that exist and to find the epiphanies that they need to find in order for us to vote people out of office and the right people into office? What are the kinds of experiences or resources that you would recommend to people like my mom, right, or others who just don't know, right? If she has it in her, she just doesn't know. So what would you say to someone like that?
That's an excellent question, and it's going to be our concluding question. So I would ask people to offer their thoughts on that, and any final thoughts that you have.
The hardest conversations are sometimes to have at the dinner table and not the conference table, because generally in places like this, we're speaking to the choir. So that definitely is a hard conversation to have. I mean, the only thing I can say is, one is that we cannot operate under the assumption that we can transform everyone's mentality. Because if a person has lived a long life and they're deeply ingrained and they have a system of belief, it's very hard to change that. Now, with that being said, I'm an unhealthy level of optimism. Like I believe that like certain people people can change, absolutely. I would point to like really good, healthy stories, as tedious as that may be. Everything from Alice Marie Johnson being given the title of pardon czar, all the way down to State Assemblyman Eddie Gibbs, other formerly incarcerated people who are being elected to office. There are a number of stories. The movie Sing Sing, like there's some really good, powerful movies that and streaming shows that like can really change someone's perception of who it is that we're talking about. But at the same time, acknowledging that yes, someone shouldn't get pushed in front of a train because you got to go somewhere. So there is a fine line to walk with that.
Yeah, I think it's important, consistent with what Khalil is saying, that we expose people to different bodies of information so they can grow and transform in their thinking. The other thing I would appeal to you to think about is connecting with some organizations that do that kind of work, right? So they can empower you and inform you as well. To Khalil's point, right, sometimes it's incredibly difficult to get somebody who's fixed in their thinking to move in a different way. Through consistency, however, and through exposure, there is a possibility that a breakthrough could happen wherein someone begins to start thinking differently. And the narrative piece is really, really important, as Khalil mentioned. The way in which narratives are used now and spun now is all too negative. And people just aren't informed. The other part of it is our country is a bit ahistorical, right? We don't like to consult history necessarily in a way that empowers and informs people. And I think that we have to start have it as a part of the national discourse, talk about harms that we have done as a nation, not as a means to condemn, but as a means to empower and to transform.
Jami, Danielle, any thoughts?
I mean,
We've
I
gotta
guess the
wrap up,
last thing I'd
so-
say is like people change in relationship. Like someone was asking about how I would handle a situation in an elementary school where there's this kind of complicated intersection of race and class and homophobia and none of those all in the same sector, right? And they're like, what would you say to the person? And I said, I think I would say hi, you know, or maybe hello. I'd have to feel out the vibe first. But it's like I think instead of thinking about, I think we think about narrative often in our movement as though we're ad execs. Like we're not ad execs. We could use better ad execs, but we're not, right? And so like at Common Justice, we've developed this curriculum we'll release soon for organizers that is all inquiry based. So instead of saying like, what are the talking points? What's the thing we can say? Instead saying like, what are the questions we can ask that let people change their relationship to their own lived experience? Like 1 in 2 Americans has had a loved one incarcerated, across race, almost across class, right? That's a lot of people who know something, right? And so I think some of it is like, if you've unfriended someone since November, maybe friend them back, or whatever you call friending on all the other platforms that younger people use. You know, like to stay in relationship, that if you see someone drifting in a direction that is against the interest of our shared humanity, like hold them, bring them back, right? If we want to be a movement that where we say we're not about revenge, we're not about exile, we're not about throwing people away, we have to embody that even in our most difficult and most intimate relationships. And so the question of like, what do I say to my mom
I'm
is
gonna have
the
to
best question.
bring it. I just need to get Jami in here for 20 seconds if she has
Oh,
anything.
I'm smart enough not to follow that.
Okay.
You're right. Like that is the answer. It's proximity. You know, that's what I was thinking as the questioner was talking about his mom. I'm like, is she in relationship with either folks who have experienced harm or caused harm? But so I have nothing. I know when to be quiet.
Excuse me, also well said. And I'll just quickly say that all this ties to beginning in education. We have an education system in America that does not teach our children how to think critically, that tells them what to think, how to think, what to say and when to say it, what to believe. And so if we really want to get at it, proximity is key, but it's also ensuring that this generation, future generations, have the capacity to think for themselves. I want to thank you all. I believe that you all, not necessarily me, but you all got us off to the right start. The aim, the focus at this crossroad juncture is to do good while doing no further harm. Thank you.